Hi, good afternoon, folks. Welcome again to another SPE technical session. My name is Zavi Munan. I'm the program chair for the SPTT Trinidad and Tobago section. We've been just trying to have as many technical talks for our members and future members as possible. Here's a taste of what we've been doing over 2024 into 2025. Quite a lot of talks, and here are some of the talks that we have coming up. So on the 12th of March, we will be heading to Tucker Energy Services. At their office, they will be doing a talk basically featuring fracking, right? And its application in Trinidad. On the 14th of March, I will actually be leading a field trip with the GSCT on re-exploring Trinidad's mature onshore gas fields, and that's at Carapal Ridge and Baraka gas fields. That's with Tufstone Exploration, and we depart South Park at about 8:30 a.m. in the morning. Then on the 23rd of March, we would be hosting SP Distinguished Lecturer Jean-Paul, and this event will be taking place at Bricks Hotel in Port of Spain. His topic is Mastering Uncertainty, a critical skill for petroleum engineers in a complex world. Then on the 9th of April, we will then have a talk by S&P Global, principal analysts, Victor Ramirez and Jaka, and they will be talking on an overview of the latest E&P activity in the Caribbean and Venezuela. This will be an online talk at 12 noon. 23rd of April, we will then be hosted at Expro, their office in South Oropouche. Steve Sunilal, the operations manager, will be going through gas reservoir testing. This will be at 5:30 p.m. at their offices. And then on the 21st of May, we then host another SP Distinguished Lecturer, Johan, and he would be speaking at Bricks Hotel in Port of Spain, 6 p.m. on enhanced oil recovery in unconventional reservoirs from lab to the field. And so now on to today's talk. So today's talk is by Dr. Jamie Vinnels. Jamie is going to be speaking on controls on Central Atlantic Margin Prospectivity. He's an independent geoscience consultant and has spent the last 20 plus years looking at field development, play to prospect scale screening, and evaluating new venture opportunities worldwide. Recent clients include Beacon Offshore Energy, Navitas Petroleum, and Shell. He has a master's degree in geology from University of Liverpool, master's degree in petroleum geology from University of Aberdeen, and a PhD from the Turbidite Research Group at the University of Leeds. So without further ado, I give you Jamie. And just to let you all know, folks, you can leave questions in the chat, and at the end of the presentation, we'll read through these questions, and Jamie will have a go at them. Right.
Okay. Okay, hopefully you see my slides.
Yep.
Pointer.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
thanks, Xavier. So I gave a similar presentation to the CBTH group at U of H a couple of weeks ago. Basically looking all around the Atlantic, just looking at kind of the key elements that petroleum geologists look for. So Xavier asked me to kind of do another run through. This time we're going to focus a little bit more on this side of the Atlantic. So hopefully it's of use to you lot. It's also aimed at kind of early career people. You may be kind of just starting your careers or doing internships. So this might help you familiarize yourself with some of the kind of workflows you may encounter when you enter the industry. So right now the Atlantic is kind of one of the major exploration hotspots. It's recognized by many analysts. Basins on both sides of the Atlantic have a lot to offer in terms of discovered resources or reserves, so what's recoverable, but also stuff that's in the ground, so the resource base of the blocks. Here I put this map together based on published information. So the circles represent published reserves. So that's what companies can actually get out of the ground. You can see kind of major hotspots like the West African Transfer Margin, the MSGBC Basin, Niger Delta, parts of Angola, and then down to the Orange Basin. Over on the west side, you've got kind of the Santos Basin, not much running up the coast, and then you've got Guyana, Trinidad, and Venezuela. The little triangles represent work I did myself. That's basically looking at individual prospects or leads and then trying to come up with an estimate of some kind of resources. So that's, it's unproven hydrocarbons. And that's an important distinction many of these kind of competitive intelligence companies don't make, is between reserves and resources. So reserves is what you can actually get out of the ground and make money off. Resources is what's in the ground, and that can be proven or unproven. But I think that that's an important distinction to make, so you know what numbers you're actually talking about. But when you look at those, other hotspots emerge. So, the Sierra Leone, kind of Liberia margin, Suriname down through French Guiana, and then kind of Uruguay into the kind of Pelotas Basin, and then other southern African basins, so like Lüderitz, Walvis, Orange Basin, but they all come with their own challenges and risks. Ultimately geology has a say in what's recoverable from the ground, so you really need to listen to it. A lot of companies are talking about reserve replacement. So there you need a portfolio that's scaled to produce that. So both geographically, but also what's in the ground is important. So, this came out yesterday in GeoExpro, which shows, some of the majors kind of land position, but this is in kind of an area only perspective. So you can see some companies have quite a balanced portfolio from both sides of the Atlantic, and then others are skewed very heavily to one side. But what this doesn't show is the resource density or potential of those blocks. So that's an important piece to look at. When you're looking at these more frontier areas, understanding the risks involved, the subsurface risks, is important, and that dictates the work program that you follow to look at polarizing those risks. For example, shooting, modern seismic to get some kind of uplift there, or working on other parts of the petroleum system to try and de-risk it and move it along. But ultimately, what you want to come up with is a quality portfolio. So, rather than just having these huge areas where it's like, yeah, you look how big our blocks are, you have to constrain the choice somehow, and that's by imposing geological criteria. So there's various ways of doing this. Shell have this approach, play-based exploration, which I think many companies have something very similar. And that's to really just establish a foundation of products. So on a regional scale, that can be, these kind of regional seismic interpretation projects where you can buy large geophysical surveys, like GravMax surveys, and interpret them. So map out the broad sequences, understand the tectonic stratigraphic history of the area, what the wells tell you, if any. But ultimately, you're shaping that towards some kind of portfolio, both of plays, where you've sweet spotted the plays. So you're looking at the overlap of primarily the source rocks, the traps, and the reservoirs, and determining these sweet spots. Ideally, you do this work before you access the blocks, but that's not often the case with these kind of reconnaissance type licenses, where you get the block first and then you do the work, hoping that the sweet spots are in the block. But ultimately, you end up with a risk portfolio, and that helps you make decisions. Because otherwise, if you haven't scored things, how do you decide? And through this process, what you learn from doing the work is what activities you need to do to kind of refine those decisions. So it puts everything into context. So rather than just having a load of prospects, kind of without context, you've got some kind of geological criteria to score them effectively. And when you're one of these majors that has hundreds of wells to drill a year, you need to be able to break things up into kind of chunks, like risk categories, volume. And it's ultimately the volume that you need to replace your reserve base. So, if you've worked in an exploration team, a lot of the job really, aside from seismic mapping, is getting those maps into kind of modeling software like GeoX, for example, to kind of look at numbers really. So important inputs are both the mapping, the parameters. So say the net to gross, the porosity, then the distributions you impose upon those. So you're not just putting a number in, you're putting in a range. And you press go and you end up with a range of volumes, and then you can risk those. So this chart up here just shows just some potential risk scenarios. We don't need to discuss necessarily the breakdown of the numbers, but it's to show ultimately what contributes to the PG numbers. So when you're in a frontier setting, there's a lot of uncertainty. So you may be dealing with prospects or plays that have, risks kind of less than 10%. So more likely to fail than to work. But another way of looking at it is, what do I need to do to improve that number? So you can look at what are the key risks, and I break them broadly down into three: the trap, the reservoir, and the source. And there are other ways to subdivide it, but I think, that's fairly universal way of looking at things. Um, Another thing that, I mentioned before, a lot of the numbers you see in the press, say, in these kind of pundits are, they throw big numbers out like 10 billion barrels discovered, but you need to know what that number's actually referring to. And often it's probably the bigger numbers like the P10. But typically in exploration, you're making decisions on the minimum, or not the absolute minimum, but something like the P90. So that's what you're risking. So in terms of reservoir, let's say you drilled 100 meters of sand in 10 wells in the area. If you put 50 meters of sand in as your P90, you're probably good for risk there. If you put 1,000, then you're arguing for something that you haven't seen. So it's not that it's not possible, it's just that it carries risk. So I hope that's clear. It's also good to include the upside. So, for majors especially, you need to be getting into blocks that offer that upside potential, because if everything's small, it's going to be very hard to get those impact volumes. So you hear the term impact volume a lot. In most of the companies I've worked in, this is usually 100 million barrels net recoverable to the company. So just bear that in mind. Other useful things to do, so this is from an Exxon paper, is to look at the spread or the difference between the P10 to the P90. So what they note in this published work is that in dry hole settings, the P90 to P10 ratio is, almost 12, whereas with discoveries, it's much narrower. So to some degree, that reflects, maybe with discoveries, a little bit more than you thought you did about the area. But with these things that fail, they typically fail for the reasons that you actually predicted. But it is what it is. If something has a PG of 10%, then statistically you need to drill 10 of them to get one to work. Not all companies can afford to do that. Good things to do. If any of you've worked in oil company majors, you probably have these QA, QC type groups, these kind of internal audit groups, or in smaller companies, you have external auditors. That's really kind of twiddling the dials on these parameters to end up with numbers they're happy with. And again, it's about having a balanced portfolio where everything's kind of looked at the same to remove bias. And another way of doing that is through these success failure analysis projects where you look at wells and you try and give an honest appraisal for what actually happened. So what went right and what went wrong. Another important part of exploration is to look at the whole opportunity space. So don't just pick on an interval, but try and evaluate everything from the kind of seabed down to the base of the kind of prospectivity flaw. So I mentioned before about reserves versus resources. There's various ways of reporting it, but the PRMS, or Petroleum Resource Management System, is a very common way, from SPE, of looking at these things. So you have resources, which is kind of, what you think might be there, proven, possible, probable, all the way to reserves, which is what you've actually proven. And then whether you can get those reserves out economically or not, or if the technology exists to do that. So an example of those may be, in the Gulf, the Paleogene, discovered in some cases 20 years ago and has only just reached production because the technology simply didn't exist to do it. A little plug for Beacon there, Navitas. Understanding the stage you're at in basin life is also important. So I did this search in Grok. You can do it yourself in any AI tool, but
Caffè
it comes
ristretto?
all right. Can that person mute? Thanks. Yeah, one of the best ways to add upside to your portfolio is through frontier exploration. That's illustrated here. So I think these are from Atlantic basins, Guyana and the Orange Basin specifically, but also emerging basins. So if you can follow quickly success, you're in potentially a good position there. But it comes at a risk. So, these are high risk things, but high reward. And it's often only the larger companies that can afford to do this, to drill 10 wells in a basin, whereas other companies only have maybe one shot, two at best, before they're done. So, it's a portfolio game. So you need to understand risking fundamentally. And at the kind of basin entry scale, statistically, petroleum system understanding is the main risk or the main mode of failure. So that's the thing you really need to focus on when you're entering a basin is primarily the petroleum system, so where the kitchens are, but also the nature of the source rock, especially if you want oil. Second to that is reservoir and then trap. So trap really comes in at a prospect scale where every prospect's lived its own life. So, a lot go wrong. But typically, the success failure projects I've worked on, and then there's this study here from Exxon. Trap seal is generally the failure mechanism at prospect scale. So again, this portfolio view and look back is very important. Looking at some of the individual elements, so I thought I'd add a kind of South American flavor to what I showed previously. I'm sure many of you are aware the main prolific source rock along this part of the world is the ECT, the Albian Cenomanian Turonian source. So you have it deposited around Ghana, Suriname, all the way up through to Venezuela. And then you also have counterparts on the conjugate margin. So you hear a lot about conjugate margin plays, and what's going to be the next Guyana. But the next Guyana, if you do that, is basically West Africa, because that's the thing that's conjugate to it. But that's only really relevant in the early stages of rifting where, things are really close together. So they share a common marine basin, perhaps. But as they go into the kind of post or, drift phase, everything's kind of moving apart. So in Guyana, for example, a lot of the reservoirs were deposited after the two continents are separated. So maybe the reservoirs aren't conjugate. So you just have to think there. In terms of source rocks, they're not necessarily deposited everywhere. So this is an example from Suriname, looking at the Turonian. But in this they admit that it's maybe not present or mature across much of the Demerara Plateau, so you have to invoke other source rocks. So that just means you have to do more work, which is fine because that's the job. And that's where the exploration mindset comes in. It's looking for these, so-called acmes, like periods of a good source rock deposition or candidate source rocks. Thinking like oil. So how does oil migrate? Vertically, laterally. It tends not to sit in synclines. It migrates to structures or other traps. You can start top down by looking at seeps. We see seeps, so therefore we think there's a working system. Or you can model it using your map framework, which is probably more robust. ideally you do both. You also need to understand the burial and uplift history and timing. So often with strat traps, the oil is basically being generated more or less now and filling the traps now, versus having to rely on long-term storage. So it just, you have to do the work. But again, at play scale, petroleum system issues are the biggest cause of failure. That's statistical. Reservoir, that can be grouped into two categories: presence and effectiveness. So presence, logically, is just, is it there? And then effectiveness is porosity and permeability. But fundamentally, if you don't have a reservoir, then you can argue about porosity and permeability all day. But without a container, you're kind of doomed. So the extent of the reservoir and its thickness are two of the biggest contributors to a prospect or lead volume. So trap area and thickness. Porosity has less of an impact on volume. But obviously, you do have to worry about it in terms of recovery factor and permeability. But we've seen from other basins that, if you have a lot of relatively low quality rock with oil in it, you can still develop it, versus having, a tiny amount of good quality rock. So, again, thinking in those terms, good candidate reservoirs come from, for example, the Guyana Shield, where you have the kind of pre-Cambrian or older Roraima group. So eroding these granites and, sediment or metamorphosed sedimentary rocks provide good candidate reservoirs. They very rapidly reach the base of the regional slope through these canyon systems where they're deposited along the base of the regional slope. And they form these channel kind of lobe complexes, and they're just stacked up, these huge piles of them. So that really helps with your resource density. So it's not like you're looking for one big fan, you're looking for stacks of them. So here's an example from Corentyne, just in border Stabroek. CGX drilled these wells a couple of years ago, just showing, stacks of these things. But again, it comes down to the scale. Do you have enough of these to kind of commercialize the development? In this case, we'll see. Another consideration is porosity versus depth. So in some West African basins, they reach the porosity floor at relatively shallow depths, but some wells in Guyana, so these are actually Kawa and Wei, these two wells, found pretty good porosity at depth, although there's maybe some permeability challenges there. In terms of trap, so broadly looking around the Atlantic, these kind of Gondwana breakup sequences are key. So, as the continents are splitting apart, you have this fairly dramatic kind of shelf edge, against which you have these basin floor fans depositing. And this is a working geometry in West Africa in the MSGBC basin, for example. You have Tortue, Sangomar, or SNE, and others. Also, shelf edge plays can be important. Another component, looking at Ghana, for example, is having stratigraphic traps, but they've experienced some degree of modification. So here, this example from Stabroek, the reservoirs kind of got deformed slightly by this monoclinal structure, and that basically creates the trap. So it's both a combination structural and stratigraphic trap. There are various ways to detect this. Rock physics is very, very popular and it does work. But these are two examples here from what I believe is South America. Sorry, just trying to get the bar to go away. From a DHI paper by Exxon. So this example up here has what you might think of as a flat spot, and this one doesn't. But the one that actually worked was this one, which doesn't have a DHI. So it shows it can be useful, but really, again, it comes down to you just have to keep testing these things. So to go from resources to reserves, you need to drill these things. But as I mentioned before, at prospect scale, trap seal is the greatest cause of failure. So this work from BP talks about, understanding the wrapper, so both the top seal, the lateral seal, and the base seal. So think about everything basically. In terms of context, position in the system is key. So, if your source rocks are down here in the lower Cretaceous, for example, so this is from the Orange Basin. If your reservoirs are very close to your source rock, that's kind of good. So they're the first kind of beds to receive the charge, as it were. Also, position along the system is key. So this inner basin trend in Namibia, the Orange Basin, you're seeing this kind of discovery trend of Mopani. Rhino recently announced favorable flow testing of their discovery, and then you potentially have other wells coming along soon down into South Africa chasing this trend. Then you go through this, what could potentially be a bypass zone, into a basin floor system where you have Venus and others. So there you have a very extensive resource, but you're in quite deep water here and your well count's pretty high, so it gets expensive very quickly. So you have to think about water depth potentially. But again, I think a lesson from Mopani is if you have lots of small things stacked together, that really helps with your resource density to justify, the cost of an FPSO, which is maybe a couple of $1 billion in this setting, plus the drilling. So, maybe 5 billion plus just in capex alone. So, in a remote austere area. So we'll see. Including Guyana in that, again, I think context is key. So understanding the development of South America over time is key to understanding where your best reservoirs might be. And those, in the case of Guyana, are outboard of the Guyana Shield. And we'll see how it goes for chasing those down the margin. But again, being in this sweet spot where you're kind of along the base of slope, the regional slope, with sands kind of pinching out onto that paleotopography is a good place to be, especially if you can modify it with a little bit of later kind of structuration. And again, it's stacking up the resources to give you the volumes that you need to commercialize it. Again, with scale, so, Exxon accessed Stabroek in 97, I think it was, which is a huge kind of tranche of acreage. So, kudos to the people who did that. But then it took, almost, 20 years, let's say, to actually get it moving along. So it takes time and patience, which maybe a lot of smaller companies don't have. I think it also helps the orientation of their block. So it's kind of parallel to this base of slope trend. So Exxon have done a great job of capturing essentially a whole trend. And then we've seen last year they accessed a block in the Barbados accretionary prism, which potentially is chasing this trend kind of underneath the prism, or maybe they have some other ideas and there's actually bits and pieces incorporated into there. But again, it's that scale that gives you the running room, to basically create commercial value. So it's a consideration, the size and orientation of the blocks. And again, scale. So here I just cartooned on some fans. But, as you go to the northwest, without getting into the politics of things, this area could open up, a whole bunch of additional fan systems. So not just the Burbis Canyon, but other canyons and paleo deltas running through this area. So we'll see. So it's kind of an exciting time to be looking at this part of the world. Coming back to risks, I thought I'd just pick on West Africa, just because there's a lot going on here. There's the interplay of provenance, so what's going on onshore. You've got kind of basins that are opening and rifting with overprint and volcanism at the same time. So that can impose, some control on trap integrity. So you may breach these traps later. I think recent well results in Cote d'Ivoire have shown you really need to understand how turbidity currents behave. If you're up on the slope, turbidity currents tend to bypass slopes and create these very relatively narrow corridors. So they're relatively discrete, and they may be focused in specific areas. So, for example, the ENI discovery recently is around where it says 3 here. So it's around there. Gas condensate discovery of 1.5 billion barrels, according to the journalists. So whatever that number refers to, I mean, that sounds great. Again, it just shows to context is key, and you need to understand all the risk elements. And there are areas where potentially you don't have access to charge from, let's say, the favorite oil-prone kitchen. You may have to place smaller kitchens. Um, so we'll see. But yeah, there's been a big land grab from majors in the last couple of years along the margin. Total, Petrobras, Eni, Chevron. So we'll see. Uh, Another example from the Atlantic, I'm calling it Pelotas, but basically the Uruguay, Brazil, Argentina kind of margin. You know, again, there's potentially a lot going on here. When it comes back to, again, opportunity space, so I think it was Total and my former employers, Equinor, drilled this well here, where, and they stopped in the, I think it's the Paleogene. Had they kept going, they may have been able to test what could be a conjugate play to the Orange Basin. So, you know, since then, there's been kind of like some swaps. So we'll see what goes on here. But having posted this kind of stuff publicly, some of the feedback I got was that there could be issues with the petroleum system here. You know, with it being gas prone inboard of this kind of dotted area. But gas in shallow water could work, especially if there's enough of it. So again, we'll see. Um, it would be great to see some drilling on this. I don't know if there's any wells actually directly coming up. I think it's more companies acquiring seismic, so it could be a way out from drilling. So, I mean, that's why it's not featured on this. So these are wells basically coming up or drilled this year. So, as I said before, Eni made a discovery here. You have a positive flow test in the Orange Basin, and then some other wells coming up. So we'll see. And again, some companies have taken a kind of 50-50 approach almost of, you know, let's be on both sides and see what works. And other companies are being more focused, but, you know, they're all being pushed to replace their reserves, you know, which is ultimately, you know, the money in the bank, as it were. So, you know, I expect more access and maybe some more swaps or deals coming up. But key again is get blocks big enough to deliver commercial value. So little blocks are great, but you're never gonna do anything with them, frankly, at a frontier scale because they're just too small. Geology has a say, so listen to it. What activities are you going to do to change the risk picture? You know, and especially learn from any mistakes that you've made as a company or other companies have made. And as I've said before, just exploration's a portfolio game. So, you know, it's about numbers at the end of the day. It's good to have exposure to a number of plays and a number of basins, you know, and ideally not necessarily 100% exposure. So develop partnerships. You know, we've seen Eni and BP do that with Azule, their kind of their JV company up and down the margin, you know, and I think we could all agree that, you know, they're onto something there. So maybe establish strong partnerships with other good players, you know, and work as a team. And again, it just comes down to this: do quality work, and you'll end up with quality decisions that help you decide. With that, thank you for the opportunity to present.
Hey, thanks.
Any questions?
Thanks, Jamie. We got a question here, which is, what's the approach to applying risk numbers to migration?
Well, at a prospect scale, it would be, can you migrate hydrocarbons into a prospect? So that's also known as focus, for example. So, I mean, let's just use this as an example. Let's pop it into slideshow. If you want to charge this, let's call this a prospect here. You know, kitchen's down here. You have to rely on kind of lateral migration as well as vertical. And it may be that that's not actually the highest point that it sees. So if it comes back to thinking like oil, the oil is just going to keep on going. So it's not going to stay in your trap. It's going to leak, you know, ultimately to the seabed. But I mean, one perspective I have from the Gulf is that these traps are often in, kind of a dynamic state. So they're never truly fully sealing. They may be leaking in parts, but if they're getting active charge, then they're refilling, hopefully at, comparable rate to what you're depleting it. Let's see if we have any other examples. Yeah, here, if you have a prospect, let's say this star here, and this is your source rock kitchen, you're outside of the kitchen. So again, you're relying on migration. And if you don't have focus to the prospect, then it carries a risk. It doesn't mean necessarily that there won't be hydrocarbons in there, but you have to risk it. So generally with source rock, you have source rock presence and then migration are two kind of elements. So is it mature, generating hydrocarbons, and can I actually fill my trap? And then another question is, can it generate enough hydrocarbons to fill my trap? Hope that answers the question.
Yep, thanks.
All right.
Folks, yeah. Folks, if you got any more questions, just you could leave it in the chat or you could unmute and ask the question at this time.
All right, I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, well, I guess no further questions yet. Um, well, Jamie, on behalf of the SPE, I want to thank you for your talk on looking at the equatorial margin and and walking us around through the Cretaceous prospectivity and some of the upcoming drills and stuff to look out for testing display across the conjugate. So on behalf of the SP, here's a certificate of appreciation for the talk.
Great. Well, thank you, and have a good day, everyone.
Yep. Thanks. Thanks, everybody.
See you.
Thank you.